Welcome to Beyond the Ordinary, a space for extraordinary souls navigating a world that often feels anything but simple. The battles you face, the challenges that test you, these are not random. They are the refining fires that meant to shape you into something much greater. Here, we explore the grace, strength, and wisdom that emerge when you rise above what others call impossible. This is your journey to uncover the extraordinary within. Welcome back, and if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. What you're about to hear is built differently. I use the power of AI to produce the show, not to make things up, but to save time and give you daily access to something that would otherwise take months to create. Every episode is built around a specific framework of books, lectures, expert research, and analysis distilled into a conversation that you can actually observe. And if you've been skeptical about AI, I totally understand. Like anything in this world, technology can be used to harm or to heal, anti-life or pro-life. My intention with the show is to demonstrate what's possible when you use these tools for something genuinely good, for your growth and for the world. My goal is not perfection, it is access. Access to knowledge that can authentically expand how you think and how you live. Stay open-minded and let's go deep.
So, by the year 2027, the traditional map of the world won't just be outdated. According to, one really radical theory, it's going to be completely meaningless. Like your country's borders, its president, its standing armies, nuclear stockpiles, all of it, totally obsolete.
Right, completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. The only thing that will determine if you are, a ruler or a subject in this new world is literally just a server farm.
Yeah, it's a total dismantling of how we've basically been taught to understand global power. I mean, we are shifting from this era where territory and, oil-dictated sovereignty to an era where the sheer physical infrastructure of artificial intelligence is just, the only metric that matters.
And that is exactly the paradigm we are stepping into today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We are looking at a highly provocative, really sweeping, and frankly, pretty alarming worldview laid out by a speaker named Daniel Satchkov.
It's definitely a lot to take in. Oh, it really is. And our mission today is to map out this entirely different reality he presents for you. We're going to connect some wildly disparate dots here, from the rise of what he calls global technates to a looming, structurally inevitable war in the Middle East, to the pre-planned use of UFO narratives as a psychological weapon.
Which is just a wild pivot, by the way.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to the aliens, but it all ties into a very real ticking clock for your own personal economic survival. But before we take a single step further, I know we need to establish the ground rules for this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. The source material we're unpacking today is, it's intense. It contains highly controversial geopolitical assertions, alternative historical interpretations that aggressively challenge mainstream consensus, and some deeply ingrained political and religious viewpoints.
Right.
So I want to be perfectly clear to you, the listener, right up front. Our objective today is not to endorse, validate, or legitimize these claims. We are not taking a side, nor are we arguing for the truth of this worldview. Our goal is strictly analytical.
We're basically just acting as your impartial guides here to dissect the architecture of his arguments. We want to understand the mechanisms of his theory, how he connects these massive global events, and just the underlying logic of the paradigm he's built.
Exactly. It's about understanding the framework itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. The absolute foundational premise, like the bedrock of Satchkov's entire theory, is that the concept of the independent nation state is just dead. He argues that right now, as we speak, the globe is being aggressively carved up into what he calls technates.
Yes, technates, or tech blocks.
Yeah.
And to really grasp this, we have to kind of redefine the word sovereignty. Because, traditionally a sovereign nation is one that can defend its borders, feed its people, govern itself without outside interference.
Sure, the standard textbook definition.
Right. But the core argument here is that in the 21st century, true independence has nothing to do with the size of your infantry or your natural gas reserves. Sovereignty belongs exclusively to the entities that control the foundational technology of the future.
It's like looking at a global game of Risk, but you have to completely wipe the board clean of tanks and soldiers. Instead, you're, counting graphic processing units and endless miles of fiber optic cable, right? And industrial scale liquid cooling systems.
That's a great way to visualize it.
And in this new game, according to the source, there are only a very few major players left holding the cards. He outlines a few of these blocks. For instance, he points to an American technate, which he claims is not just the US, but like an expanding sphere.
An expanding sphere that absorbs its neighbors, yes.
Right. He specifically cites the current economic strangulation and blockades on Cuba as a deliberate mechanism to eventually absorb it, along with Venezuela, Canada, and eventually pushing all the way into Greenland.
He also briefly categorizes a European technate, describing it as a somewhat isolated, distinct entity operating on its own bureaucratic track. But where his framework becomes incredibly disruptive and where it violently clashes with everything we see on the evening news is his characterization of the Chinese technate. And specifically, the role of the Russian Federation within it.
Wait, hold on. Because we have spent decades viewing Moscow as a primary autonomous geopolitical antagonist. The Cold War, the space race, the current conflicts, I mean, the entire Western worldview relies on the idea of Russia as a formidable, independent superpower.
Yeah, that's the established narrative.
But Sachkov controversially claims that the Russian Federation is nothing more than a, quote, sub-vassal appendage of China. He argues Russia has practically zero independence left. How does he even justify that leap?
Well, if we connect this back to his definition of sovereignty, the mechanism of this subjugation becomes very clear. In his view, you cannot be a superpower if you do not manufacture your own digital nervous system.
Okay, I follow.
So why does he call Russia an appendage? Because, he argues, the Chinese technet supplies the entirety of Russia's foundational control technology. We're talking about the millions of surveillance cameras lining the streets, the massive facial recognition neural networks, the internet whitelisting tech that filters what citizens can see.
And the core hardware routers that direct all internal communications, right? Like all of it is Chinese technology.
Precisely. It is all imported from China.
So it's not about who has the most tanks. It's about who wrote the firmware for the communication system inside the tank.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of how this neuters a military. Imagine a scenario where a nation wants to execute a domestic policy or mobilize a military asset, but the underlying network architecture, like the literal microchips and code facilitating that action, was designed, installed, and is ultimately maintained by a foreign power.
Oh, wow.
That foreign power possesses the ultimate backdoor. They can throttle bandwidth, they can introduce deliberate blind spots and surveillance, or they can entirely crash the system via remote whitelisting protocols. The one who supplies the technology is the true master. The one who buys it is merely a vassal.
That fundamentally shifts how you view alliances. Like if your entire country's digital infrastructure relies on the servers of another nation, you are an ally negotiating at a big round table. You are a dependent. You're basically renting your sovereignty.
You're just a consumer. And this brings us to why there can only be a few technates in the world. Artificial intelligence, true, world-running neural networks, is not just abstract code floating in the cloud. It is aggressively physical.
Right. People forget that the cloud is just a massive building full of computers somewhere.
It requires an astronomical amount of physical infrastructure. You need massive warehouse-sized data centers. You need millions of advanced parallel processors. And because these processors run incredibly hot when training AI models, you need industrial cooling systems pumping millions of gallons of water.
And most importantly, you need a dedicated, colossal energy grid just to keep the lights on.
Yes, the energy draw is immense. So because this infrastructure is so violently resource-intensive, only a few geographical hubs on Earth can ever hope to be the masters. Everyone else is relegated to simply consuming the final product.
Which sets up the ultimate question of his theory. If controlling this massive physical AI infrastructure is the absolute key to global dominance, who is sitting at the very top of the technological food chain? Who holds the ultimate trump card here?
And this leads us directly into what is undoubtedly the source's most central and likely most controversial assertion, the absolute supremacy of the Israeli technate.
Yeah, he really hones in on this.
He does. The speaker posits a very specific geographical concentration of power. He identifies Israel not merely as a tech-savvy nation, but as the undisputed central nervous system of global AI and neural network development. He asserts that all pivotal world-shaping technologies were, in his words, consciously pumped into that specific region.
And he doesn't just make this claim in a vacuum, right? Like, he points to specific corporate movements to back it up. He cites Palantir, for example. Now, for those who don't know, Palantir is this massive data analytics firm deeply embedded with U.S. defense, the CIA, global intelligence contracts.
Officially, it's an American company.
Officially, yes. But Sajkov argues that structurally and functionally, it's practically an Israeli firm disguised under an American corporate banner. He claims they preferentially hire Israeli citizens for core development and are fundamentally inextricably tied to the Israeli state apparatus.
He also points to Elon Musk.
Right, noting statements about Musk locating advanced robotics development centers in Jerusalem.
He's weaving these distinct data points together to illustrate a deliberate centralization. The argument is that the most crucial technocratic advancements, the algorithms that will dictate global logistics, surveillance, and military action, are being intentionally corralled into this one small geographic location.
And the reason this concentration of brain power and hardware is so critical, according to the source, comes down to the grim reality of future warfare.
Yes, because if you have the best AI, you really don't need the biggest army.
He argues that the days of massive infantry engagements, sending thousands of young men in boots across a field with rifles, are completely over. By 2026, he predicts wars will be fought entirely with swarms of AI-driven drones and autonomous robots.
Let's examine the mechanics of that for a second.
Yeah.
A drone swarm does not operate like a squadron of human pilots, where each pilot makes individual decisions based on a shared objective. A swarm operates on a single, unified neural network. It's a hive mind.
Right.
If one drone identifies a target, the entire swarm instantly adapts its flight path, targeting, and evasion tactics simultaneously. The speed of decision-making is limited only by the processing power of the AI, not human reaction time.
So in that reality, the physical number of human soldiers a country can draft is mathematically irrelevant. I mean, 1 million soldiers with rifles cannot shoot down 10,000 microscopic drones flying at supersonic speeds, communicating at the speed of light, and making tactical decisions in milliseconds.
It's just not physically possible.
The victor of the next major conflict will simply be the entity sitting in a data center with the most powerful neural network controlling the swarm.
Exactly. It renders traditional demographic military advantages completely obsolete. However, this creates a logical puzzle within the speaker's own framework.
Yeah, I was wondering about this.
Israel is a geographically tiny nation with a relatively small population and limited natural resources. So how could such a small state construct the massive resource-heavy infrastructure required to become the dominant technate?
Right, they don't have infinite land for data centers and cooling lakes.
Exactly. And to answer this, Sajkov takes a massive, unexpected turn. He completely rewrites the historical narrative of the 20th century.
Oh man, here's where it gets really interesting. And I mean, he takes a sledgehammer to the standard Cold War history textbooks we all read in high school. He introduces this highly unorthodox claim that Joseph Stalin, the brutal dictator of the Soviet Union, was the true founder and initial savior of the State of Israel.
Yes, this is a profound deviation from the conventional historical consensus.
To put it mildly.
The standard accepted narrative heavily emphasizes the role of the British Mandate ending, the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947, and ultimately the crucial, immediate diplomatic recognition and moral support provided by the United States under President Truman.
But Sajkov claims that in the late 1940s, during Israel's critical existential early conflicts, the War of Independence, the U.S. actually enacted an arms embargo.
They refused to provide the heavy weapons the nation state needed to survive.
Right. Instead, Sajkov argues it was Stalin who stepped into the void. He claims Stalin provided the crucial arms, the artillery, the resources, and the diplomatic cover through proxy states like Czechoslovakia that literally kept the state from being wiped off the map.
He even claims that historical figures like Golda Meir openly acknowledged this Soviet salvation.
It really forces you to pause and consider how historical narratives are constructed and how they might be manipulated or smoothed over to fit modern geopolitical alliances.
What is fascinating here is not necessarily verifying the historical exactitude of the arms shipments. Again, our role is to analyze his structural argument. It's about why the speaker introduces this specific Stalin narrative into his grand theory.
Right. It isn't just a historical trivia point for him.
Exactly. It serves a vital structural purpose for his entire worldview. It establishes a behavioral pattern.
What kind of pattern?
The pattern of the sponsor. The speaker is arguing that Israel, by its very geographical and demographic nature, is not fundamentally self-sufficient. To survive, To build this massive technocratic infrastructure and to project power, it absolutely requires an external, massive host or sponsor superpower.
It needs an entity with vast wealth, immense energy resources, and a massive military umbrella.
Yes, to protect it while it builds its internal technate.
It's like a symbiotic relationship. Or, well, given the tone of the source material, perhaps he views it more as a parasitic one.
According to his theory, Stalin was the initial sponsor. The strategic logic for Stalin would have been to secure a socialist-leaning foothold in the Middle East, a warm water proxy to disrupt British and Western influence in the oil-rich region.
That makes a kind of ruthless geopolitical sense.
But, the speaker argues, when Stalin realized that Israel was pivoting toward the West and would not align with his rigid Soviet agenda, he abruptly withdrew his support. And that exact moment of withdrawal, the speaker argues, is when the United States was recruited to become the new permanent sponsor.
Okay, let's follow his logic here. If we accept this premise that a tiny nation needs the absolute backing of a massive superpower to survive and theoretically subjugate its much larger neighbors.
Neighbors like Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, all of which Sashkov currently dismisses as mere vassals to the Israeli technate, yes.
Exactly. It begs a massive glaring question. How on earth do you convince America to do it? I mean, how is the American public, a nation separated by the Atlantic Ocean, historically leaning toward isolationism and dealing with its own domestic issues, convinced to take on the incredibly costly, politically fraught role of the ultimate sponsor?
That is the crucial pivot in his entire argument, and it's where he delves into psychological and cultural engineering. The speaker believes that this monumental shift in American foreign policy was not merely secured through backroom military deals, pragmatic Cold War strategy, or standard diplomatic treaties.
So it wasn't just guys in suits signing papers.
No. He argues that to maintain the level of unyielding multi-generational U.S. support required, the American elites and the general public had to be deeply, systematically, and psychologically conditioned.
And the mechanism for this conditioning, I gotta say, when I read this in our source material, I had to read it twice. He traces the psychological engineering all the way back to the 19th century to one specific book. The Schofield Reference Bible.
Yes, and to provide some necessary context here, the speaker identifies himself as an Orthodox Christian. From that specific theological and historical standpoint, he views the Schofield Reference Bible not as a legitimate, spiritually inspired text, but as a deliberate, politically motivated distortion of Christianity.
For those who might not know, the Schofield Reference Bible was published in the early 1900s. It wasn't just a new translation of the text. It was heavily annotated.
It had footnotes and explanations printed right next to the scripture.
Right. And Sachkov argues that these specific annotations inserted a theological framework, often called dispensationalism, that effectively mandated unquestioning support for the physical state of Israel as a core, unshakable tenet of the Christian faith.
It tied the modern geopolitical state directly to biblical prophecy.
Essentially arguing that to be a good Christian, you must support the state of Israel, regardless of its secular, geopolitical, or military actions.
He alleges that this theological shift was essentially weaponized. It wasn't just a book sitting on a shelf. According to his narrative, American Protestant pastors, specifically within the rapidly growing evangelical traditions of the 20th century, were utilized as agents of influence.
Whether wittingly or unwittingly, right.
Exactly. Imagine the mechanism of this. You have thousands of pastors preaching from these specific footnotes week after week, Sunday after Sunday, decade after decade. It cultivates a sincere, deeply held, multi-generational grassroots support system.
It's like a century-long foundational software update to American culture. It ran quietly in the background. It wasn't about hiring lobbyists in Washington to bribe politicians. It was about programming the voters from the pulpit.
Because if the voters believe that supporting this foreign nation is a mandate from God, then any politician who wants to get elected in those districts has to adopt that foreign policy.
He says this conditioning peaked from the Reagan era in the 1980s right through the 1990s and 2000s, getting to the point where, in his words, America essentially ceased to be an independent actor. It stopped making decisions based on American interests and became a total vassal to the technet.
But as with any complex system, there are vulnerabilities. Every paradigm has a breaking point. And this brings us to what the speaker identifies as the current, urgent existential crisis facing this entire technate structure.
The 100-year ideological software is crashing.
A massive glitch in the matrix. Precisely. The speaker argues that the initial cracks in this conditioning began to show during the Iraq War. He claims that the drawn-out, bloody nature of that conflict awakened a significant portion of the American public to the reality of pointless, incredibly costly foreign interventions that ultimately served no tangible domestic American interest.
It planted a seed of profound skepticism regarding foreign policy narratives.
But the true death blow to this conditioning, the event that is causing the system to completely crash, he argues, is happening right now in the post-October 2023 landscape.
The TikTok factor. The speaker claims that the advent of unfiltered, algorithmic social media has completely bypassed the traditional legacy gatekeepers of information.
Let's look at how information used to be controlled. During the Gulf War in the 90s, or even the early days of the Iraq War, the American public saw war through the lens of major news networks. The footage was curated, edited, and contextualized by anchors and military analysts.
It was sanitized.
It was sanitized, yes. But the speaker points out that a platform like TikTok operates differently. The algorithm serves raw, user-generated content directly to the viewer based on engagement, bypassing any editorial board entirely.
He specifically points to the viral videos emerging straight from the current conflict zones, videos shot by the soldiers themselves. He argues these videos show the extreme, unfiltered, and often deeply uncomfortable realities of war.
He mentions footage of soldiers behaving unprofessionally in bombed-out civilian homes, playing with children's toys in the rubble, or raw first-person sniper footage set to pop music.
He argues that seeing this visceral reality on their phones day in and day out, stripped of any heroic narrative, has absolutely destroyed public support among the younger generations. The software update has just been wiped.
And he highlights a truly staggering demographic shift to support this claim. He asserts that over half of the youth population under the age of 60, and he is very emphatic about including young Jewish Americans in this specific statistic, are turning entirely against this historical, unconditional alliance.
Wow.
The old guard, the over 60 demographic whose worldview was cemented during the peak of that theological and political conditioning, are holding on to the old programming. But the youth, who get their information from decentralized feeds, are rejecting the narrative wholesale.
So the 100-year ideological software update is fundamentally crashing because of a glitch called a social media algorithm. And this demographic shift is causing absolute panic among the leadership of the technate, according to the source.
We're looking at the internal polling. They're looking at the demographic aging of their most loyal supporters, and they're realizing that the clock is running out.
Right. And this demographic reality is the engine that drives all the rest of his geopolitical predictions. Think about the structural logic here. If the loss of the youth demographic means that time is rapidly expiring on the American sponsor model, then the Israeli technate faces an existential deadline.
It knows it cannot rely on American taxpayer dollars, American military hardware, and American political cover at the United Nations forever. Therefore, it must urgently, aggressively transition to total, unassailable, technological, and regional self-sufficiency.
And to cement that dominance before the American shield completely evaporates, it must eliminate its only real remaining regional threat, which bridges us perfectly from the history of ideological conditioning into his most terrifying immediate prediction, the inevitable imminent war.
Exactly. So let's look at the map again. If Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE are already compliant, neutralized vassals in his framework, who is the final boss? Who is the last remaining obstacle preventing total Middle Eastern dominance by the Israeli technate?
The source identifies Iran.
In his framework, Iran is positioned not just as a sovereign nation with its own borders, but as a sprawling ideological control center. Iran is the central hub influencing and supplying Hamas, Hezbollah, and significant militant elements within Iraq and Syria.
For the technate to finalize its total, uncontested control of the region, the Iranian node must be permanently neutralized.
And Sachkov doesn't say this might happen if diplomacy fails. He doesn't say it's a worst-case scenario. He insists that full-scale war with Iran is completely 100% inevitable. He claims it is entirely pre-planned and structurally required.
And to prove this, he references a very specific media moment that happened recently, an interview on Tucker Carlson's show featuring Mike Huckabee, the recently appointed U.S. ambassador to Israel.
Yes, the speaker analyzes a specific exchange where Carlson asks Huckabee about the theoretical idea of Israel expanding its territory to encompass a vast portion of the Middle East. And Huckabee, according to the speaker's interpretation, essentially responds that it would be normal or acceptable for them to take it all over.
The speaker views this not as a political gaffe, not as hyperbole, but as a deliberate, open admission of the true, long-term geopolitical agenda being spoken aloud. Because in Sachkov's worldview, the political theater we all obsess over on the news, the endless debates over who won the election, what Putin said in a press conference yesterday, what Biden or Trump promises for the economy tomorrow.
It is all a grand orchestrated illusion.
It is entirely meaningless noise designed to distract the public. The singular underlying goal is the establishment and security of the technet. And therefore, the war with Iran is a mathematical, structural requirement. It must happen, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office.
This is a vital central component of his philosophy. He urges his audience to completely stop analyzing geopolitics based on the public statements of politicians. He argues that parsing campaign speeches or debate transcripts is a fool's errand.
Politicians are basically just middle management, key representatives for the underlying power structures, right?
That's his view. Instead, one must look purely at the structural goals that the technology blocks. If the goal is a regional technate, and Iran possesses the geography and proxy forces to disrupt that technate, then the war is not a political choice. It is a structural certainty.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this deep dive? I mean, it is very easy to get lost in these grand, sweeping geopolitical theories about AI swarms, rewritten 1940s history and Middle Eastern borders. But Sachkov brings it right back down to earth. He brings it right to your wallet and your kitchen table.
He predicts that this inevitable war with Iran will trigger a devastating, unprecedented new wave of global impoverishment. He argues that the economic fallout will be catastrophic because of geography.
Iran controls incredibly crucial maritime choke points, specifically the Strait of Hormuz, through which a massive percentage of the world's oil flows.
He argues that in the event of an existential war, Iran has the military capability, via mines, anti-ship missiles, and asymmetrical naval tactics, to completely block that strait.
This disruption, he predicts, will cause global energy prices to skyrocket overnight, sending economic shockwaves through the global supply chain that will be vastly worse than the inflation or financial crises we've experienced in the last few years.
But wait, I have to push back on something here because there feels like a contradiction in his logic. If, as he says, all domestic politics is fake, and politicians are just actors distracting us from the technate's grand, inevitable plan for global war, why do these politicians bother spending months negotiating and passing actual complex economic legislation?
Like, why do presidents bother fighting over things like import tariffs or tax codes? If it's all fake, why do the paperwork?
That is an excellent question, and it's exactly where the speaker's theory becomes incredibly intricate regarding domestic policy. He views economic policies, specifically fluctuating tariffs, not as genuine attempts to protect domestic industry or balance trade deficits. He views them as deliberate instruments of psychological warfare against the domestic populace.
Okay, you have to explain the mechanism of that. How is a tax on imported steel considered psychological warfare?
Let's unpack his specific example. He looks at Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies and the subsequent legal battles, Supreme Court challenges, and constant modifications. The speaker argues that the true goal of these tariffs isn't economic reform.
Okay, so what is the goal?
Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario to illustrate his point. Let's say you own a medium-sized steel fabrication plant in Ohio. If a government genuinely wanted to bring manufacturing back to your town, they would set a stable, protective tariff and guarantee it for 10 years.
Right, because this predictability allows you, the business owner, to confidently go to a bank, secure a loan, build a new factory expansion, and hire 50 new workers, knowing the market conditions are stable. Business relies entirely on predictability. You can't plan a 5-year expansion if the rules change every 5 months.
Exactly. But the speaker points out that the current implementation of tariff policy is completely, perhaps intentionally erratic. Tariffs are imposed by executive order, then they are immediately challenged by a federal judge, then an appeals court modifies them, then a new administration drops them entirely, and then a rumor starts that they will be reimposed next week.
It's chaos.
He describes these massive fluctuations as emotional swings inflicted on the market.
So what happens to our guy in Ohio?
By creating this massive systemic unpredictability, our factory owner in Ohio is paralyzed. He won't take out the loan, he won't build the expansion, he won't hire the workers, he just freezes.
Oh, wow.
And more importantly, this paralysis bleeds down to the average citizen who is kept in a constant churning state of economic confusion, anxiety about prices, and ultimate inaction. This is a classic psychological manipulation tactic known as learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness. That's the psychological concept where if you subject an animal or a person to unpredictable, unavoidable negative stimuli, they eventually just give up trying to avoid it. Even when an escape route is later provided, their spirit is broken by the changing rule.
Precisely. When the economic rules of the game constantly shift without logic or warning, people freeze. They stop trying to start businesses, they stop trying to improve their situation, and they just hunker down, waiting for the chaos to end. It creates a docile, dependent population.
And while the public is frozen, paralyzed by this manufactured economic chaos and distracted by the political theater of who is imposing the tariffs, the architects of this global shift are quietly locking down the real resources, the servers, the energy grids, the AI infrastructure.
But here is the flaw in that plan.
Okay, what is it?
If the goal is global impoverishment via a Middle Eastern war, and you are purposefully paralyzing the public while you shift the entire world order into these hyper-controlled AI technates, eventually people are going to notice.
Yeah, people definitely notice when they can't afford groceries. They notice when the banks freeze their accounts. You need a massive, reality-shattering distraction to explain away the collapsing banks, the broken supply chains, and the ruined economy without the public blaming the technets.
And that logical requirement for a massive distraction leads us directly to the speaker's warnings about organized disinformation, false binaries, and perhaps the most bizarre, unexpected element of his entire theory.
The strategic pre-planned deployment of UFO narratives.
Yes, the UFOs.
This part of the source material is absolutely wild. He starts by warning his listeners not to fall for what he calls false binaries, the classic example being the American two-party political system.
The ingrained belief that voting for the political right will magically save you from the tyranny of the political left, or vice versa.
Right. He argues that the figures leading these factions are ultimately serving the same structural transition. He claims the figures like Donald Trump are actually utilized to intentionally discredit legitimate, sovereign-protecting policies.
For instance, he claims that Trump took the concept of protective economic tariffs, which the speaker actually views as a vital common-sense measure for any independent nation to protect its workers, and turned it into a toxic, highly volatile, partisan concept.
He makes the exact same argument about domestic border security. He views the agency, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, as essentially the necessary immune system of a sovereign nation. Everybody needs an immune system to regulate what comes in.
But he claims the political right's highly aggressive, inflammatory rhetoric and actions turned ICE into a hated, violently perceived entity in the culture.
By doing so, they effectively soured an entire generation of American youth on the very basic concept of border security for decades. It's a brilliant, insidious reverse psychology argument. If you want the public to reject a good, protective idea, put the most controversial, polarizing figure in charge of it so the public learns to instinctively hate the idea.
Furthermore, he warns about navigating the modern media landscape, specifically calling out the rise of independent influencers who have replaced traditional news anchors. He warns that these figures are often deployed to feed the public a carefully calibrated mix of profound truth and paralyzing deception.
He mentions a Professor Zhang, right, describing him as a suspiciously viral Chinese academic on YouTube. This professor allegedly provides excellent, highly accurate geopolitical analysis to draw in a smart, questioning audience, but then abruptly pivots his content, attempting to pull his audience toward Islam.
He also points to Tucker Carlson as someone who is allowed to reveal important structural truths about global alliances, but who simultaneously pushes narratives designed to keep the audience agitated and distracted from the ultimate technological takeover.
And what is the ultimate, grandest, distracting narrative of all? UFOs. I have to admit, when I was reading the source material and hit this section, it felt like a massive, jarring pivot. We've been deep in the weeds talking about supply chain economics, graphic processors, Middle Eastern borders, tariff psychology, and suddenly we're talking about aliens.
It's definitely a leap.
It feels like watching a master magician perform this incredibly complex, subtle sleight of hand, and right as they are about to quietly pick your pocket, they just throw a giant, blinding smoke bomb right in your face.
It is a jarring pivot, certainly. But if we analyze it within the strict logic of his framework, it serves a highly precise, necessary function. The speaker points to a sudden, coordinated shift in recent, highly publicized events regarding extraterrestrials.
He notes Trump declassifying specific UFO documents, former President Obama openly confirming on late-night television that there are physical objects in the sky maneuvering in ways the military cannot explain.
And Elon Musk repeatedly tweeting warnings about extraterrestrial threats. The speaker claims this sudden openness is not a genuine process of scientific discovery, nor is it a sunny urge for government transparency. It is a coordinated, pre-planned psychological operation to establish a scapegoat.
He says they're essentially holding the UFO card in their back pocket. Think about the timeline he's laid out. When the inevitable war with Iran hits, when the planned global economic crash happens, when the massive retail banks inevitably fail, or when the global cyber systems mysteriously go offline.
The ruling elite won't go on television and blame their own failed economic policies. They won't admit that the transition to the AI technate required gutting the middle class.
No, they will go on national television, point to the sky, and blame alien hackers or a hostile extraterrestrial threat.
It provides the ultimate, unquestionable excuse. If humanity is facing an alien invasion, it justifies any level of domestic control. It allows the technate to declare absolute martial law, seize all private assets, freeze all bank accounts, and push a totally totalitarian agenda, all while the terrified public practically begs them for protection.
The public won't blame the real architects of the collapse. They will be too busy looking up at the sky in terror.
But this raises an important question, though. How do you fake an alien invasion convincingly enough to fool 8 billion people?
Yeah, that's the multi-trillion-dollar question.
And this is where the speaker champions a specific philosophical concept. Sobriety, or in the Russian Orthodox tradition he references, trezvini. It translates roughly to profound spiritual and mental clear-headedness, the ability to look at a terrifying illusion and not be moved by it.
He is urgently urging his audience to apply this deep sobriety to the coming media spectacle. He points out the mechanism of the deception. We live in an era of terrifyingly advanced AI video generation. We have military-grade, localized holographic technology.
And crucially, we have tens of thousands of advanced privately owned satellites like Starlink, currently in low Earth orbit.
Right. If you control the satellites, the internet backbone, and the AI video generators projecting a terrifying, hyper-realistic spectacle into the sky or onto every screen on Earth simultaneously is technologically trivial for the people running the technates.
Exactly. It is the ultimate black swan event, manufactured entirely on demand. It is a staggering leap in logic, going from tariffs are used to induce learned helplessness to they're going to literally fake an alien invasion with holograms to cover up a bank run.
But you can see how perfectly it fits into a worldview where absolute top-down manipulation of reality is the defining feature of the global power structure.
With politicians acting as mere paid distractors, the global economy deliberately designed to fail through manufactured unpredictability, a massive war pre-planned for the Middle East, and literal fake alien invasions on the horizon to cover up the collapse.
A listener might feel entirely hopelessly overwhelmed. The natural response to this level of systemic determinism is absolute despair, like why even get out of bed? However, the speaker does not end his discourse on a note of doom. He actually pivots to offer a highly specific, aggressively proactive, and intensely time-sensitive escape hatch.
Yes, this brings us to the ticking clock. This entire geopolitical theory isn't just a vague prophecy about some distant dystopian future. Sachkov sets a hard, terrifying, immediate deadline for action.
He explicitly states that the years 2026 and 2027 are the absolute last years you have to prepare. The window to secure your independence is closing right now.
He argues that after 2027, the trap snaps shut. The foundational tools of the new era, advanced computers, high-end graphic processors, essential communication hardware, will be completely hoarded inside the core of the technates.
They will become prohibitively expensive, highly regulated, and essentially unavailable to normal, unconnected citizens.
He warns that remaining in the traditional legacy economy is a death sentence for your independence. He uses a highly evocative, dismissive phrase to describe the modern white-collar worker: office plankton.
Office plankton?
Yes, office plankton. He argues that relying on a corporate salary, sitting in a cubicle, editing spreadsheets, and relying on massive retail chains for your survival will inevitably result in destitution and forced compliance to whatever the technate demands. When the banks freeze, your digital salary is meaningless.
Office plankton. It's a brutal image, just floating aimlessly, waiting to be consumed by a bigger fish. He is saying the entire white-collar world is a comfortable trap. His actionable advice to you, the listener, is to completely stop being a passive consumer and instantly become a physical producer.
And he gets very specific about what you need to learn. He emphatically tells people to learn 3D printing, and he emphasizes doing it right now, before looming U.S. laws heavily restrict or outright ban the technology for regular citizens, precisely because 3D printing allows you to bypass corporate manufacturing monopolies.
He is advocating for a radical return to hard, physical, tangible skills. He explicitly lists learning computer hardware repair, mobile phone repair down to the motherboard level, automobile mechanics, and the practical utilization of open-source neural networks while they are still publicly accessible.
His core philosophy here is the immediate construction of a robust parallel economy.
Right. It's about evaluating your own real-world utility stripped of all digital illusions. You need to ask yourself right now, if the internet backbone goes down tomorrow, if the banking apps freeze, or if the grocery store supply chains break down, what tangible physical service can you offer your neighbor in exchange for a loaf of bread or a gallon of clean water?
A degree in marketing or a proficiency in Excel isn't going to feed your family. You need to be the person who can fix the solar inverter or 3D print a broken tractor part.
And to facilitate this, he specifically promotes a platform called Barteron. He describes it as a free, decentralized network designed specifically to facilitate the direct peer-to-peer trade of physical goods, water, energy, and mechanical skills among independent adults,
Completely bypassing the fiat currency systems controlled by the technates.
If we synthesize the core philosophy of the speaker, taking all of this sweeping theory into account, it ultimately comes down to one word: agency.
Despite laying out one of the most grim, deterministic, and overwhelmingly powerful geopolitical forecasts imaginable, a world ruled by untouchable, resource-hoarding AI blocks, inevitable, devastating regional wars, and psychological warfare via UFOs, his ultimate message is deeply, surprisingly proactive.
He fundamentally believes that by ignoring the distracting political theater on television, by focusing intensely on acquiring physical, tradable skills, and by building localized, resilient community networks, individuals can retain their human sovereignty. You can build a lifeboat outside the rigid digital structure of the technate.
Okay, we have covered an immense, almost dizzying amount of ground today. We started with a radical idea that traditional nation-states are dead, replaced by AI-ruled global technates fighting over cooling water and processors.
We navigated a completely rewritten history where Stalin founded Israel as a geopolitical proxy. We broke down the mechanics of how a 100-year theological software update was delivered via the Schofield Bible, only to be crashed by the raw algorithms of TikTok.
We explored the structural prediction of an imminent pre-planned war with Iran designed to impoverish the globe. We waded through the bizarre logic of faking an alien invasion to cover up a bank run, and finally, his urgent, ticking clock plea for you to stop being office plankton by a 3D printer, learn to solder a motherboard, and join a barter economy before the door slams shut in 2027.
It is an incredibly complex, multi-layered, and challenging paradigm. And while we must reiterate once again that our purpose today was to unpack the architecture of these claims rather than endorse their factual accuracy, the exercise of exploring such extreme paradigms is incredibly valuable.
Why? Because it forces us to rigorously pressure test our own deeply held assumptions about how the world works. It demands that we examine where global power truly lies, and it forces us to confront just how deeply dependent we have become on fragile, easily disrupted global supply chains, and on incredibly complex digital technologies that the vast majority of us simply do not understand.
It certainly makes you look at your smartphone, the evening news cycle, and the price of goods at the store in a completely different light. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over, a profound contradiction built right into the very heart of this deep dive. The speaker vehemently urges you to use the internet, to download open-source AI models, and to buy complex tech hardware right now to learn the skills you need to survive the coming collapse of the system.
But if these massive, omnipotent technates truly control the physical routers, if they monitor the data flows, if they write the whitelisting protocols, and they manufacture the very hardware you are buying,
is using their tools to build your off-grid parallel economy actually freeing you? Or are you just inadvertently training their AI to understand exactly how you plan to escape?
Everything we explore today is only as valuable as what you do with it. Information without transformation is just noise. Over the last decade, I've built a methodology specifically designed to help you take what you are learning about your mind, your emotions, your consciousness, and yourself, and actually live it, use it. Use it practically in your daily life. It is the methodology which I called the ALIM method, which stands for awareness, letting go, intention, and mindfulness. Or when you master it, it becomes a life in miracles. And if today's episode stirred something up in you, come find out how I can put it into practice, how you can use this practical tool in your life. Visit alimmethod.com or connect with me on Instagram, Spirit of James.